Hello everybody, Chris Teal here, director of the second annual Fayetteville Jazz Festival. Just popping in right before the next workshop, just to give a reminder. Check down in the description of this video. There are lots of opportunities to help out not only this festival through donations, but also get yourself involved playing music and also supporting scholarships for our Institute for Creative Music virtual summer camp that is still happening. We're going to do this with a combination of pre-recorded videos that the IfCM has been doing for quite a while, but new content, of course, for the summer campers at a variety of different levels, and a lot of live interactive workshops, kind of in lieu of doing jazz combos. We're going to have sectionals, all kinds of stuff. And so check out the description of all the things that are going on as we go forward after you enjoy all of these videos from the Fayetteville Jazz Festival. We're very excited to be able to introduce to the Northwest Arkansas audience a new friend of ours coming all the way from New York City. She'll be presenting a performance involving some of her original compositions, which you can check out on Ears and Eyes record, her latest album, as well as an extensive workshop covering scat, singing, and improvisation. Please enjoy Lauren Lee.
Hi there, my name is Lauren Lee. I'm a singer and piano player based in New York City. I'm excited to be presenting this for the Fayetteville Jazz Festival. And I wanted to give you guys some pointers on scat singing. So I run a program called Sing Like a Horn, which is what it sounds like, where you're using your voice in an instrumental way, singing like a horn, singing like a saxophone player or a clarinet player or a trumpet player, or creating these things that are seamless and they sound good and it's melodic and all of these things, and not just kind of poking around in the air for pitches. So when people think of scat singing, I've had a lot of people give me some pretty funny answers where they're like, oh, what's that thing where you go shadooba-dooba-dooba-dop? And I'm like, well, kind of. Or, and, it's that weird thing you do with your mouth, you go bop-bop-it-up. Or what instrument are you actually imitating? And it is those things, but it's more than that on a fundamental level. So the reason why we use these kind of like funny sounds and funny syllables is because we're not singing words. So if we're not singing words, we have to have some way for the sound to come out. And these different syllables create different articulations. So for example, if I was going to sing on this chord, this is a D minor 9 chord, for example. If I wanted to sing something more lyrical sounding, something a little bit like smoother, I might make my syllables a little gentler sounding like this. La 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 la. If I wanted something more like poppy in your face kind of, I might use a more plosive consonant like a B sound like this. I might put a little bit more punctuation on the end, like kind of a sound. And think about what instruments you know that make those kind of sounds. When I think of a more articulated sort of ba-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da-ba-da sort of sound, let me try that again. I think more, it sounds more trumpety to me, if that helps you. When I think more connected, more lyrical sound, it's more like a saxophone. Of course, when I'm actually making those sounds, I'm not necessarily assigning an instrument to it because the voice is its own instrument. I'm not coming at it from I need to imitate an instrument. Like think about somebody like Louis Armstrong. When you hear him sing and play the trumpet, it sounds kind of the same because that was what he did. But for me, when I'm improvising as a singer, I'm not thinking about imitating an instrument necessarily. I'm just thinking about, well, what am I trying to get across here in tension? If I'm singing something on a ballad, for example, something like at a slow tempo, like, let me set this up. I'm not going to go. I'm not going to do this crazy stuff. I might do something a little bit more lyrical like this. I'm doing kind of a combination of plosive and non-plosive. So anyway, that's one angle to talk about with scat singing. What I wanted to talk about to begin with is some fundamentals of scat singing. So we have the syllable choice where I'm choosing a neutral vowel. I'm choosing a consonant that's either plosive or non-plosive depending on what the vibe is, I guess is the way to put that in musical terms. But also, I'm not saying that everybody should subscribe to my methodology of consonant and vowel choosing. It's more about what feels natural to you. These are the things that feel natural to me. I don't move my mouth very far. My mouth isn't very big. So things that feel natural to me might be different than to you. Especially, I think there's some difference in what languages people speak as a first language in terms of what becomes comfortable for them in choosing scat syllables. So as long as you don't feel like you're chewing on it and that it's like, I'm trying to force this out of my mouth, I think that whatever you choose will be fine. But keeping in mind, like, what syllables are going to be easier to sing legato, what syllables are going to be easier to kind of use as accents, these kind of things are worth being mindful of. So we talked about the articulation. Now let's talk about the pitch. So when you're scat singing, the point is to make a solo that's melodic over the harmony. And depending on what your harmony is, you have some different options. So you'll often hear people talk about making the chord changes or what are the changes on this tune, and what they're talking about is the harmony. So if I was playing changes to a tune, like for example, one of the most common chord progressions in jazz is the 2-5-1, and that was what I was playing on before. So you have this sound, which is a minor, a dominant, and then a major, and that sound is really prevalent throughout jazz harmony. And the reason why it's so important is because, like, you'll hear this in almost any tune. So if you can sing stuff, language, interesting lines, feel confident over this chord progression in different keys, you're gonna have a lot of stuff that you already know. So when you learn a new tune, you're like, oh, I recognize those changes. That's a 2-5-1. I can sing, here's my encyclopedia of stuff that I practiced over that. And so you'll hear people say the phrase making the changes or nailing the changes or hitting the changes. They all mean the same thing. And what it means is that you're singing something or playing something, if you're playing an instrument, that fits really well with the chord. And there's different ways to make the changes. You can think about the chords in different contexts. Like, for example, the example of a 2-5-1, we talk about those three chords being part of a larger key area. So, for example, what I just played, I played D minor 9, G dominant 9, or G dominant 13, and then C major 9. That is all part of the key of C major. So if I sang only notes from the C major scale, that would technically be making the changes. So let me demonstrate. I sang the same note over and over again. It was super boring. Did I make the changes? Technically. Is it great? No, it's not. There's a lot of different stuff that you can do with it. If I did something like this, did I make the changes? Yes. Did I sing anything interesting? No, I sang the C major scale up and down. So that's making the changes, but it's not really making the change. It's not making something out of the changes. It's not making something interesting. So it's supposed to start, but it's not what I recommend doing. I would recommend doing some other things. So when we talk about making the changes, what people I think are normally referring to is, are you aware of what the changes actually are? Are you hitting the notes that are super important in those changes? And that becomes more and more important as the harmony gets more complicated. So we're talking about a 2-5-1, everything is diatonic. It's all part of the same key. All this is diatonic. It's all part of the same major or minor scale. If I played this chord progression, does that sound like it's all part of the same key? It does not, because it isn't. So it's a couple of different key centers that are shifting around. And so when you have changes like that that are moving around and going to different key areas, you have to be on your toes and know where it's going. Because if you hear the song and it starts, say, in the key of B major, and you're like, cool, I know B major, I know the B major scale, I'm going to sing the B major scale in different ways through all these changes. And then all of a sudden, the bridge of the tune goes somewhere totally unrelated. Say it goes to the key of A flat major, and you're still singing this over that. It's gonna sound like you have no idea what you're doing because you didn't make the change. So you can think about chord changes in this way, where it's more broad and you're thinking about a key area. But generally, to really nail the changes, you want to be very aware of what each individual chord actually is. And you want to sing something that is indicative of the fact that you know what it is. And so on every chord, you have these notes that are called guide tones. And what a guide tone is they're the most important notes of the chord, because without them, you will not know what type of chord or what quality of chord you're dealing with. So, for example, if I was playing, going back to my favorite chord, which is D minor 9, if I played that, I played D, F, A, C, and E. This is the 1, the 3, which is lowered, the 5, the 7, which is also lowered, and then the 9. It sounds like that, right? If I took away the F, which is the 3rd, I would have this. If I then took away the 7th, which is the C, it would sound like this. So now I'm just playing 3 notes. I have D, A, and E. Does this sound major or minor or dominant or like anything other than a bunch of fifths stacked on top of each other? It does not. So without the guide tones, I don't know what chord this is. It could be dominant. It could be major. It could be minor major. I have no idea because I don't have the guide tones. So without the guide tones, chords really aren't chords at all. I mean, they are, but it's a little bit different. So, and we'll talk about that other sort of category later on. For right now, though, we're going to focus on guide tones. So every chord that you can think of has at least 2 guide tones. It has the 3rd and the 7th. So for example, if I was going to play a 2-5-1, that I grab the root, 3, 5, 7, 9, and then for the 5 chord, same thing. I've got root, 3, 5, 7, 9, and then for the 1 chord, I have the same thing, root, 3, 5, 7, 9. So if I'm going to go sing these, I can start with something very simple where I'm just pulling out the guide tones and singing them. And I'm using my ear to do this. I'm playing these chords on the piano, but you can use anything, if you just want to hit the root and then sing them, you can do that. If you have the iReal Pro app, you can use that. There's some exercises in there where if you have like a pitch pipe or something, you can, it's possible to do this. So I'm going to put the voicing down here and I'm going to sing the guide tones. So here's my D minor chord. So I've got the 3rd and the 7th. And then here I've got my G chord. I've got the 3rd and the 7th. 3rd and the 7th. So you may have heard me, I'll do it a little bit faster. 3rd, 7th, 3rd, 7th, 3rd, 7th. I sang them all in the same order, meaning I started with the 3rd on each chord, but you probably heard some of those notes repeat. So I'll sing it like this. La, 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 la. The really cool thing when you're dealing with diatonic harmony is that there is overlap between guide tones in the 2-5-1. So on the 2 chord, the minor 2 chord, these are the guide tones. Then I go to the dominant chord, and the 3rd from the 2 chord becomes the 7th of the 5 chord. And then the 3rd of the 5 chord is only a half step lower than the 7th of the 2 chord was. Like that. I know this is kind of confusing, but the point I'm trying to get across is that these notes are not far apart usually, and it's pretty easy to kind of hear it. So I'm just gonna sing it one more time. Da, 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 da. Those are my guide tones. I'll sing them with the numbers again this time. 7, 3, 7, 3, 7, 3. Did them in the opposite order. Something that I would definitely advise you to do with these guide tones is to try to create something that sounds cool, something that sounds melodic, just with the guide tones. So now you know what they are, and you can start to play with that. So I'm just gonna sing. I'm gonna pretend this is a tune, and we'll call it the 2-5-1 song, and I will sing some guide tone stuff on it. And if you're watching this and you want to join in, that's cool. We can do it together. So here's our tempo. 1, 2, 3, 4. Da, 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 da. Da, 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 Something that I like to talk about when I teach improvisation is that the invention kind of comes from necessity. So when I practice things, I practice them until it's like past the point of being useful, and then I definitely, I'm like, I have to do something else with this, and it forces me to be more creative. So if you're limiting yourself to 2 notes, you will think of all the different ways you can sing those 2 notes. You can displace the octave. When you go through the changes, you don't have to sing both of them every single time. You can just sing one, and you're still making the changes. You're still nailing the changes because you're like, I got that guide tone. And if you get the guide tone, people are gonna know you know what the chord is, and that is definitely what you want. So to kind of skip ahead several steps in this, you might be thinking, well, what if I'm at a jam session and I'm taking several choruses on a tune? Do I have to sing a guide tone every single time? The answer is no. Once it's established, I think you can move on from that, or if you have an idea and it happens to not include a guide tone a couple of times, that's fine. It's not gonna be like, oh no, they messed up. It's more like, also for memorizing tunes, like memorizing harmony, the guide tones are essential because sometimes I won't remember what the chord actually is. I won't remember like the name of it, or I won't remember, like if I had to make a lead sheet for somebody, I might be like, oh, I don't remember what the chord name is, but I remember what the guide tones are. So then when I go solo on it, the solo doesn't sound like nonsense. For the most part, it sounds like I know what I'm doing, even if I kind of forgot maybe what the tune was actually called. So the guide tones, super duper much your friends. Like, you want to be able to do this, and you want to practice on them as long as possible, because it's going to help you memorize common chord progressions. It's going to help you memorize chord progressions for specific songs. Like, there's really no downside to it. And then in terms of using the guide tones in practical ways, like for creating melodic content, guide tones are really great to start and or end your phrases on. So for example, back to our favorite 251 song, 251 in C, over and over and over again for all eternity. I might start my phrase on C, which is the 7th of the D minor chord. Everything I sing was diatonic. Let's make it a little bit spicier. I totally noodled around in water I was not comfortable in at the top of that, but that's part of the fun of practicing, is you can do things like that and no one knows except everyone who's watching this video heard me do that. So cool, great. Everybody makes mistakes. Anyway, that's the fundamental principle of making the changes, is knowing what the guide tones are. Now, other types of chords might have an extra guide tone. So if you're dealing with chords that sound like this, for example, you might notice a similarity between that and what we were playing with before. So this is also a 251, but this is now minor. So some chords have an altered 5th scale degree, or they have an altered 9th scale degree. And when I'm talking about guide tones, I include them in with the 3rd and the 7th, because otherwise you're like, well, is it just minor or is it half diminished for the 2 chord? So, because like there's this, which is regular minor, and then there's that, which is minor 7, or minor 7 with a flat 5 and a flat 9, or half diminished. So, and while like they're fundamentally kind of the same thing, because they both have the lower 3rd and the lower 7th, it is a different sound. So when I hear this chord going here, I'm expecting it to resolve this way. But if I hear this chord, I might not expect it to eventually do that in this. So, I mean, there are instances where that happens. It's not wrong. I'm just saying sometimes you might want to emphasize on a chord that has an altered 5th, you might want to emphasize the altered 5th as well. So we can do this the exact same way that we were doing the guide tones on the major 251, but now we just have an extra note. So this would sound this way. So I have the 3rd, the flat 5, and the 7. And then when I go to the 5 chord, I have the 3rd and the 7th. And I might include the flat 9 because I had it on the other chord, but I called it something different. And then I have my minor 1, which has the 7 and the 3rd, like that. So instead of just isolating the guide tones on this particular exercise, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a little arpeggiated melody, and it's going to sound like this. And I'm landing on the 5th that time. I could also land on the 3rd. That's really low for me, just why I didn't end on it, but you can do what you want. Let me see if I can do something different. I can land on the 7th too. But that's kind of what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about the guide tones being a great choice for beginning and ending the phrases, because It's a more interesting choice than the root of the chord, which I think is where a lot of people's ears go initially. But it still sounds consonant, it still sounds final, and it's a little more harmonically specific than the root, because when we talk about like the hierarchy of pitches in a chord, like the root gives you the name of the chord, but it doesn't really give you much else information wise. It doesn't tell you what the quality is or anything like that. So arguably it's less important than the guide tones, which, fight me on that. I stand by that statement. I say that kind of stuff all the time and people look at me like I'm nuts, but that's fine. I'll be like the star of my own conspiracy theory about guide tones. Anyway, moving along, when we're talking about guide tones, we can talk about guide tones in context out of diatonicism as well. When I started this portion of the video, I talked a little bit about that, and I played the changes to giant steps, and I asked you if you thought that it sounded diatonic, and the answer is it does not. While I wouldn't necessarily advocate that you start your scat singing journey with giant steps, though you could, and please let me know how that goes for you, I do think you should look into tunes, or at least look into exercises or creating some exercises where you're maybe dealing with some chords that aren't related, or maybe they're all the same quality, but they're not part of the same scale. Like maybe you're practicing guide tones on only minor chords like this. That's a very viable way to do things. And you can create patterns that way too. It might sound something like this. Do, 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 do. You do something more interesting than that too. Do, 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 do. I did the same thing again, but I tried to make it more rhythmic. Dun, 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 dun. So you can do things like that, and then also start to fill that in a little bit, like creating some other sounds that you can hear from the chord. If you're listening, if you're playing the chord voicing, if somebody else is playing the chord voicing, or using a recording, start to pull some other notes that you hear out. And when you're first starting, like melodic integrity is important, but when you're first starting out, especially if you're doing this mostly by ear, listen to the harmony first. Don't feel like you have to just right out of the gate sing something. Like hear the chord first and then sing something. And then especially if a pattern repeats a lot, you'll be like, oh, okay, now I have an idea of where this is going and I can create something more melodic. So that build up might start something like this. So I hesitated because I couldn't remember what the chord progression was. Haha. Anyway, that's a thought as well, starting with like the same type of chord. And it doesn't have to be even that rhythmic. You can start with something that's more just, I'm going to sit on this chord for a while, I'm going to think about the different possibilities, and I'm going to move on. So let's try something like that this time with major chords. So I'm doing this sound. Here's the third, here's the seventh. So I'm going to start with just the guide tones. I'm going to sing as much as I can on that idea, and then I'm going to move and fill it in a little bit with some other things that I'm hearing. And I'm going to change my voicings around in my right hand to give myself stuff to grab onto. Ta-da, 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 ta-da. can just do that, and it's a nice drony type of thing. Again, play it just the root note and see if you can find the other things above it. So here's the third, here's the seventh, and if you're having trouble with that, the easiest way to find that seventh, especially the major seven, is to just sing the octave. So here's the root, this is a G. Here's the root, this is a G. Here's the sharp, or the F sharp, it's a seventh. So you can find that without playing a chord also, if that's what you want to do or that's what you have to do. Anyway, so the other sort of approach with this is having a chord progression maybe that's a little bit more repetitive, something where there's a bunch of chords that are maybe the same quality, so you can get some kind of pattern-based idea in your head. For this example, I'm going to play something kind of similar to what I was playing before, and the reason why is because I'm going to apply this to a tune that I wrote, and the basic chord progression to the beginning of the song sounds like this. So they're not all the same quality. I have D minor, E minor, F major, and then G minor. So, but this happens a lot. So there's a lot that my ear can grab onto. Starting with guide tones. Do, 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 do. Very easy. I just sang that. And I sang the seventh, the seventh, the seventh, the seventh. All of the sevenths of the chord. I can do the same thing with the thirds. Do, 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 do. It's funny how that works like that. And now I can do something where I'm maybe starting with a guide tone, filling in a little bit, and kind of going like that. I landed on the fifth. So you might be wondering why I didn't talk about the fifth in the major 2-5-1, and the reason is because it doesn't provide any information on the majors. Unless it's altered. So the fifth, like, it's not a bad note, but it's not one that I would hit over and over and over again on purpose, I guess is how I would describe that. I think it's totally fine to include it in your lines. I think it's totally fine to start and end on it, but I wouldn't treat it the way that I treat the third and the seventh, because it's not the same. It doesn't hold the same weight as those pitches do. So for that reason, I did not talk about it there. I only talked about the third and the seventh, and then on the minor 2-5-1, I did talk about the fifth on the 2 chord because it's lowered. So anyway, that is guide tones. So I'm going to perform now a song that I wrote that I just mentioned called So Long. And the reason I chose this song to illustrate a little bit of what I was talking about isn't because the song is full of 2-5-1s, because it's actually not super full of 2-5-1s at all, but it has a lot of repetitive harmony where it's easier for your ear to grab onto something and be able to create things that sound melodic versus a song that maybe doesn't have repetitive harmony, where your ear's kind of like, cool, I don't have anything to latch onto. I have no idea what's going on. I just have to like hear this a bunch of times, practice it a bunch of times, and it's not super user-friendly. This song that I wrote, it definitely is user-friendly. The harmony is very repetitive, so songs that sound like this are usually a little bit easier to get started with for improvising and trusting your ear to lead you in the right direction. Feeling, how I've been dealing So once we've moved past the basic guide tones and kind of filling in, I guess, randomly with things that we can hear, we can talk about going a little bit further than that, because there's a lot of other options that are very cool and they're worth practicing, because it becomes about more than just making the changes, but making something interesting on the changes, making something melodic on the changes, making something that highlights the upper structures of the chords. So when we are talking about basic harmony, most people start with like a triad, like this. And then when you start learning about jazz, you maybe add the seventh, and for the fifth that time, and the ninth perhaps. But there's a whole world kind of beyond that that isn't as difficult to understand as you might think it is if you're new to this sort of concept. So when we're talking about chords in general, all chords have 7 notes. So for example, if I was playing like a C major, in this case we'll call it a 13th, I would start with the root down here, you put the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th, the 9th, the sharp 11, which I'll talk about in a second, and then the 13th. And so all of these notes that are up here, do you hear what I'm playing like this? I'm not playing the inside of the chord, I'm playing just the root and the upper structure starting with the 9th. So it ends up sounding like I'm playing a D major triad over C, which is what I am actually playing. But we could also call this the upper structures of a C major 7th chord, or the upper structures of a C dominant 7th chord. It works that way too. I have to play them because I can't, or separately because I can't play them all at the same time. So these are all possibilities as well. And the thing about them that's easy for singing and for usage in melodic context is because these notes up here, they all occur earlier in, if you play like a scale, I've got all of those notes except one that I altered. So they're already familiar to our ear. We're just calling them something different because of how they actually occur in the chord. They are up at the top. They're not, I mean, that's not to say that you can't think about it. Oh, well, I'm singing the ninth, but the ninth is also the second, it's easier for me to think about it being right by the root instead of being an octave above, because you wouldn't necessarily sing it like that. You wouldn't be like C, D. You wouldn't necessarily do that. I mean, that kind of, you could, but you might be more likely to da 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 da, like put it in something smaller like that. So when we're talking about these upper structures, you end up getting some issues where you could have stuff that really clashes. And so, for example, when I played the C13 chord of whatever quality we're gonna call it, C major, you'll notice that I played F sharp instead of F natural, because otherwise I get this sound. Get a minor ninth, which is lovely, but that's not what we want. In general, when you're altering these chords, like sometimes you want to be careful with altering notes that are really close to the guide tone, because it can confuse the quality of the chord. Not always. There are ways to do that where it doesn't confuse it at all. Like if you're resolving it to a guide tone or something like that, you can totally do that and not worry about it being like, oh, well, is it major or minor now, or is it, you know, dominant or major now? You know, we don't know. But some of these notes, they'll get sharped or flatted so that they don't create something like a minor ninth, where it's going to be like, oh, it's not going to sound very good together. So, and when you listen to, like, if I played just a C major voicing here, I'll play the root too, and then I played this scale, that sounds pretty diatonic. I played the Lydian scale, that's sharp 4, and it fits really nicely over a major chord. So then when I'm improvising, all of those notes are available to me. That's 7 different ones. And so you can think about them in different ways. You can think about them in a scale shape. You don't necessarily have to call it by a scale type name if you don't want to do that. It's helpful sometimes so that you can communicate that with other people. Like you could say, oh, it's a major scale with a sharp 4, and people know you're talking about Lydian. Or if you want to be like, oh, I want to sing a scale that fits over C major. So there's a lot of different ways to practice this concept. You can do it as arpeggios, which I'm a very big fan of, like that. So you could sing that shape. What I like to do with that is I like to put that into different inversions, because it makes it so that you can start on different notes. You don't always have to start on the root. And it's also a really good vocal exercise because you can put it into different parts of your range, and that way you become much more free to express. You don't have to be like, oh, well, if I'm scat singing, I stay in this register and that's it. No, please, like, use what you have. So to keep things not screechy, I'm gonna move this down. I started it here. I'm gonna move it down. I'm singing the notes in the exact same order. I haven't inverted anything. Now the E is on the bottom and the C is on the top. So it's going to sound like this, but it's the same exact chord. And then I can start with the 5th. And then I can start with the 7th. Etc. And that would be taking those chords around, inverting them to putting a different note on the bottom, but not changing the order of the notes. I think I might have said I didn't invert it, but technically I am. I'm just not changing the voicing, I guess is how to say that a little bit better. Anyway, taking the note that was on the bottom and moving it to the top, if you want the best breakdown of that. So that's one way to practice that. You can do that on major chords like I just did. You could do it on minor chords, which would sound like this. Let me choose a different minor chord. So let's say we're going to do G minor 13. Like that. So I could sing that, and then I could move that around. Same way. I can alter that too. I can make that G minor 7 flat 5. could do G minor 7 flat 5 flat 9, which would sound like this. That was flat 13, sorry. Let me do flat 9. Or I could do the major 13 on there. You can do the same exact activities with all of these different types of chords, and that's going to give you some flexibility. On top of the arpeggiating idea, you can also turn these into scales or learn the scale that corresponds to these different types of chords. If we want to go back to the major, I was talking about doing this with Lydian, the Lydian mode before. So Lydian is the fourth mode of the major. So like, for example, if you're starting a Lydian scale on C, the major key that corresponds with in terms of like modes is the key of G, because G has one sharp and C is the fourth note. So C Lydian is the fourth mode of G major. So if we wanted to take like, you can take these different modes different ways that you want to. So you could start maybe just singing the scale up and down. And you can also sing that mode starting on different notes from the mode. And you don't have to call it anything else. You can say, well, I'm going to sing C Lydian starting on D. It becomes D mixed Lydian. If you want to think about it that way, there's a lot of different ways to label the same information, I guess is what the point I'm trying to get across here. So don't feel like you have to be married to calling it something. You can, if the sound is there, I think the terminology will come a little bit later, if it comes at all. Like, but again, to be able to communicate this with other people, you should know at least some of it. So yeah, putting stuff into different scale shapes, you can practice those scales in different intervals. You can do it in like thirds. Something like that. You can do things in fourths. Whatever kind of pattern will help you internalize it is the thing, because you want to become fluent with these different sounds. That is how you can feel free as an improviser, because if you don't feel free, are you really improvising? Without being comfortable, it's hard to not kind of fall into patterns. Like if you've been doing this for a bit and you find yourself kind of going back to the same things all the time, like everybody kind of has like their pile of stuff of like, oh, well, this is my trick, or this is the lick that I always play on this chord, or this is the way I always play on this particular tune, or something like that. Like it comes out of habit and it becomes a thing that we do because we're not practicing stuff that's different than that, or we're not as fluent on that particular idea or at that particular tempo or in that particular key as we could be. So kind of manipulating things as many different ways as you can is really, really beneficial to do at any point in your development, because it makes it easier for you to be able to switch gears quickly if you're learning tunes where the changes maybe aren't related at all and you're like, well, what do I do here? Or if you're in a jam session situation and somebody calls a tune that either they wrote or, you know, you thought you knew it, but then iffy. I mean, we've all been there. I'm certainly in that situation a lot. It can help you in any kind of context like that. And it also will just make you more creative and feel more free in general to kind of reach for different things. With that said, I wanted to play a tune of mine that I wrote called A Back. And this song has some pretty unrelated chord changes. So when I was practicing this, I definitely had to think about these different key areas that I was going to and practice getting between the key areas in lots of different creative ways so that I didn't fall into the trap of, oh, I'm playing a back. That means I'm taking these components and like putting them together like in the same way every single time, because that's not improvisation anymore. That's filling in blanks, you know, I mean, or I don't know how else to describe it. filling in blanks or kind of going back to the same thing. It's not as much fun, and it's not as creative as it could be. So anyway, I hope you enjoy this tune, and thanks so much for watching my video on scat singing.